Okay, well, welcome to a special podcast. We're going to respond to the census data, which has come out the last couple of days. So I've got two guests with me, Mark Durie and Lyle Shelton. So Mark is an Anglican minister, theologian, cultural commentator, author, writer. So he's a great friend. And Lyle, also a great friend. Really appreciate your time as well, Lyle. And Lyle is a long time cultural commentator, lobbyist, politician, lots of different things, and the recent new national director of the Family First political party. So it's great to have you here, Mark and Lyle.
Great to be with you.
Likewise.
So really interesting, guys. The data just started breaking yesterday. I don't know if you guys are kind of nerdy numbers guys like me, but I like statistics, and I was pretty excited for them to start coming out yesterday. So we've got about 25.5 million Aussies. We seem to be getting more diverse with more migration. I think over half of Aussies now have one parent that was born overseas, which is interesting. And the millennials have caught up to the baby boomers, as they are the two, basically the same amount of people in each generation. They're the millennials and the baby boomers, and they're the dominant generation. So I just slip into the millennials just by a year or two. But the thing I really want to talk to you guys about and hear from you guys is about this interesting drop in Aussies identifying as Christians. So not really surprising, but it continues to slide, the amount of Aussies identifying as Christians. So I believe that the number was 44% of Aussies identifying as Christian in the census data. And that's if you go back two censuses ago, so 2011, there was 61% Aussies identifying as Christians. That's a 17% drop. Would you like to say anything about that, the statistics? What do you think is going on in Australia? Mark, maybe we'll hear from you.
I think in Australia there's been a long history of nominalism, particularly from the traditional mainstream denominations. So I would say only about 7% of census Anglicans in the past, in 2011, were actually attending an Anglican church on a kind of regular basis. So what's happening is that the nominals are turning away from their nominalism. So there's a shedding of Christians who are not actually committed Christians. Yeah. And I've seen that in pastoral ministry as well, a huge drop off in over the last 20, 30 years in the numbers of people that would be married in a church or have their children christened for cultural reasons, and funerals no longer in churches. So I think that's the main change that's happening. It's not that Australians are just becoming less religious. Is that they're less nominally religious. They're less likely to tick that box on the census.
So you think, in a way, Mark, they're more just being honest with the census. They're more being
I
honest
think
where faith is at or not at, and just saying, well, I'm not practicing this anyway, so I'm not really religious.
that's right. They might have ticked Presbyterian in the past, but they think, well, I haven't been to church for 5 years. This doesn't make sense. So I'm just going to say I'm actually not religious. And I mean, I've known atheists who'll go to church once a year because they like Christmas carols, but basically we've had a large number of people ticking Christian on the census who actually have no real Christian commitment, except a kind of sense of cultural allegiance, a sense of a memory, and that memory is fading. That memory's fading.
And do you think that that's a good or a bad thing? Good that people are being more honest, or do you think it's bad and people should more try and align, even if they're not very active, align with some kind of faith? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think people vary on that view. Like, there are a lot of people in the Anglican Church that would regret the loss of that sense of nominal allegiance because it provides leverage for things like Anglican schools and pastoral ministries like weddings and funerals. So there's a loss of opportunities there. But I think it's more honest. And I think people are more likely to say, what would it mean to become a Christian? Instead of saying, oh, I'm a Christian because I tick that box, they're more open to a genuine conversation about what they believe. So I would say it's a good thing that the nominalism is declining.
Okay.
But I think it's misleading to secular commentators because there's a great strength in Christianity that the census is a very poor tool to measure.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. What are your initial thoughts about it all, Lyle?
Yeah, I agree with Mark. We are seeing that nominalism drop away. My understanding is that around about the turn of the 20th century, I think the original censuses after Federation showed people saying they were Christian somewhere in the mid to high 90s. So a very almost the entire population identified with Christian at that point, and even up until the 1960s, the census was still showing into the 80 percentile of Australians saying that they were Christians, and of course that's declined rapidly since the 1960s. But then in recent years, the last two or three censuses, we've seen an actual political campaign by fairly activist atheist groups to try and get people to put no religion and to really drive those numbers down. Now, that's fine in one sense in a democracy, but that has hastened, I think, the more honest approach, but perhaps even driven a slightly dishonest approach in the sense that most people are of no religion or atheist. If you really scratch the surface, you'll find they're actually agnostic and open. But the loss of I guess, the cultural ballast, I think, is probably the main disappointment in the driving down of those numbers. But I think the other thing is that we're kidding ourselves if we think that even at 44%, that the vast majority of that 44% of people who identify as Christians are truly devoted followers of Jesus Christ. I think that number is somewhere much lower, probably under 10%.
Yeah, well, I think, Lyle, that it's commonly understood that church attendance is more like 4% in Australia. I think usually that's measured on attendance once a month at church. But I'm sure after the pandemic and the lockdowns and stuff like that, it might only be 2% of people actually that identify as Christian actually attending and practicing their faith in any kind of real communal type way. So I think that for me is a lot more where the conversation should be at for those that are Christians or involved in church or believe in the active following of Jesus. I think it's more about the 2-3% that are actually doing something, and maybe the census, yes, is a bit misleading anyway around the 44%. I mean, what does that really mean when you tick that box anyway? Yeah, I think that's really interesting. What do you think, Mark, about the church attendance and actually people really practicing their faith?
I think it varies a lot from denomination to denomination. So it's interesting, only a couple of 100,000 people tick the Pentecostal box, which is sort of 10%, less than 10% of the Anglicans. But in fact, Pentecostals are bigger than Anglicans, are stronger than Anglicans in Australia, because there's more Pentecostals in church than there are Anglicans, and their presence is increasingly the second most important Christian presence in Australia. But the census completely obscures that. Firstly, some Pentecostals don't tick the Pentecostal box, so they don't think of it as a denomination. They just write Christian. And so it's I think it's quite misleading, and you have to deal with each tradition separately and ask, what is their strength and what's their likely future. I see some parts of Christianity that have been growing in Australia and will continue to grow, and there's great strength there. But there's no doubt that the traditional denominations are shedding their nominals, and that'll continue for some time. I mean, one of the interesting shifts is that it's becoming more apparent and obvious in a way that Christianity is a minority religion in Australia, and that will shift politics. In some ways, people are more willing to pay attention to minorities. There's a bias against majoritarian views, and in a sense, there's some tension there for the agnostics or atheists, in that they're moving towards it being a more major role. But so there's that. Whether Christians will be afforded any sympathy because they're a minority I'd be quite sceptical about that. But that is an interesting shift that's taking place in Australia.
Yeah. And back to your point, Lyle, isn't that part of the reason why there's like lobbying to have people tick no religion? Isn't that part of the purpose, so that if there's less Christianity statistically, or Christian statistically, then maybe that's less benefits for churches or tax breaks for pastors? Isn't that some of the motive?
Yeah, absolutely, Caleb. That's definitely a large part of the motive that's driving some of the more aggressive secularists to try and have the census, go in this direction. As I say, no problem with people being more honest in the census, but there is a political motive there, and it's designed to try and attack support for school chaplaincy, for instance. Tax breaks for the clergy, which I think are quite legitimate. That the clergy actually contributes to the social and economic well-being of society. That's why there are special tax arrangements there. But these things are driven. These campaigns in the last 2 or 3 censuses have been driven by an animus towards Christianity. But for the reasons Mark said, it may well backfire, because the average Australian, whilst they may not be someone of faith or Christian, they are sympathetic to the underdog, and they're not driven by an aggressive animus towards Christianity in the same way that some of those running these campaigns are. So I'm fairly relaxed about our position. Yes, it would be great to continue to have the cultural benefits of Christianity, because it certainly does bring benefit for the common good. But I think the average Australian is well disposed, in spite of some of the recent scandals in the church, which have been terrible and shameful. I think the average Australian is willing to give us a fair go, and are willing to consider the minority concerns of what is now clearly a minority group.
Mm. From a cultural perspective, why do you think what's happening in Australia in relation to God, Jesus, Christianity? Like, why is this trend so dramatic since maybe the 60s or 70s, away from God, Christianity? Is it affluence? Is it immigration? Is it politics? What is it?
I think the big shift towards no religion is particularly noticeable for people from Northern Europe and those that are descended from them, and also people from Northeastern Asia, that is Chinese people who've been strongly influenced by communism. Many of the other groups within Australia, people from Southern Europe or Southeast Asia, are strongly religious and in majority Christian often in those cohorts. So so you'd need to ask really the cultural factors that are shaping the trajectory of Western, particularly Northwestern European peoples. And I think it's the working out of the Enlightenment. It's working its way through education, through in the form of postmodernism, through our universities. So basically, the elite, as it were, the cultural elite in Australia, which are white Northern Europeans, have over centuries been turning away from God. I think affluence is part of that, but it's by no means the only reason. But amongst other groups, if you looked at Southeast Asians, I think you'll find a very different trajectory. So it's not the whole story of Australia. It's a story of part of Australia, the loss of religion.
Yeah, really interesting. What are your thoughts, Lyle?
Yeah, I agree with Mark. I think that secularism has been driven by that Enlightenment philosophy that's crept in over the last couple of 100 years and has captured our institutions, particularly our universities, our education system. And I guess the downside of that is the atheism that drives much of that philosophy does remove the idea that human creatures are made in the image of God, and therefore that human life is sacred. So we're seeing this play out in a whole range of areas politically, in terms of radical abortion to birth legislation that we've seen sweep Australian state parliaments in recent years, euthanasia legislation. We've obviously seen the redefinition of marriage, because people now no longer accept the idea of a created order that was seen in the past to have come from God, even though it's completely backed up by science, the idea of biology and the complementarity of genders. So we've seen marriage degenders, we've degendered, we've embarked on a massive social experiment to the point where we can't even define what a woman is anymore, and we're having disputes over fairness in women's sport, etc. So this is the fruit of a couple of 100 years, and particularly an acceleration of that in the last 70 or so years. So ideas have consequences, and what's playing out in the census will continue to have consequences if we don't rediscover, I guess, the roots of our civilization, what has made us a free, and largely prosperous and just nation, that these things didn't just develop in a vacuum. They did come from Christianity. And I hope the decline of Christianity that we're seeing in the census will cause people to pause and just think about, hang on, what are these values that we are throwing overboard? And do we like the trajectory that our society is on as a result of that?
Yeah. We're really the post-Christian era just continues to become stronger and stronger, doesn't it? For our country, we're truly post Christian now, and really those roots of Christianity, as you're talking about, Lyle. I think for your average Aussie, we're probably a long way from that. My own suburb, right here where I live, Langwarrin, was actually in the Herald Sun today in relation to the census. So there's the news flash. Town not so faithful. Langwarrin has the most non-believers, so in all of Australia. And a lot of my mates live there. I played for the Langwarrin Soccer Club for 15 years. So really, really interesting. Like, this is right out in the southern suburbs of Melbourne, so 45 kilometres from the city. And just those roots of Christianity are really not recognised anymore in our culture, and just not really seen as relevant. In my opinion, I don't think it's not a militant kind of let's get rid of Christianity type mentality that I see locally. It's just more of a drifting away, maybe a naivety to where a lot of our moral framework has come from as a country. People aren't really against it per se. I mean, you can't be against anything really, can you? In a relative, with the moral relative moral, truth is relative type culture. You can't really be against anything. So no one's against me as a Christian or a pastor. But there's just not really a recognition of those foundations. And there's also not really much of an interest. Like, people, I find, are just, as a pastor locally, I just find that people are generally comfortable or like to give off the sense that they are comfortable and life is okay and have got everything in control. I don't think that that's really the truth, because a lot of people's lives tend to be falling apart. People are very lonely. People are unsure about purpose and the meaning of life. But there's kind of this almost front, I suppose, that people put on, that I'm fine without God, without truth, without meaning, without really searching the depths of why am I here on the earth. And surely all of those cultural things and local suburbs with normal people kicking around type thinking or lack of thinking is contributing to a whole bunch of this as well. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, I wonder whether there's an ethnic component in the sense that whether there's a higher proportion of Anglo-Celtic people in Langwarrin. That would
Definitely.
that would definitely account. So these are aspirational. These would be aspirational Anglo-Celts who are seeking to make a good lifestyle for themselves. They can't afford to live in the inner city, perhaps. And they've also disconnected by moving into what's been a growth area. They've disconnected from other social roots and so on from wherever they've come from and grown up. It's a boom suburb. So I think those two factors together would suggest that there's opportunities to help ground people. But yeah, so that would be the a major factor, I think. If you're looking in areas where there are lots of migrants, there's going to be much higher religious adherence.
What about the other religions, Mark? So I know that you're quite experienced. You're known as a world expert on Islam and things like that. So what about other religions? Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the census data show that there's a slight increase in
Yes.
other religions. Is
Yeah,
that
so
just purely migration and people just holding on to their faith that they've come with from their homeland, or what is that, Mark?
Well, I think the presence of other religions has mainly been due to migration, but the growth in some of the categories is demographic. So there's more Muslims now in Australia than members of the Uniting Church, or people that are willing to tick that box. So I think that's been mainly due to demographic growth in recent years. Australian immigration is not favouring Muslims over the last 10 to 20 years. So, and I think what you'll see is because some of those minority migrant groups. Buddhism would be example, Hinduism. Those groups, because they've come into Australia through migration, particularly in recent decades, they'll continue to grow and expand because their demographic profile will be younger. They've got a lot of potential for future growth. We'll see more and more. We'll see more and more people from those religions active in public life. They'll be more and more present in our society. So yeah, that's a significant shift.
So are you saying, Mark, that do you think the future for Australia looks like a continuation of these kind of statistics? Christianity going down, non-religion going up, with migration, other religions going up, and therefore, as you're saying, those Aussies getting involved in the culture more, having more of an influence from a Sikh or a Hindu or a Islamic kind of background. I suppose that's the pluralism of our culture, isn't it? Just increasing, expanding.
I think those groups will all struggle with nominalism. Their children's children, will they be active attending the temple or the mosque? That's an important question, and really the future of those groups depends upon how active they are in propagating their faith to the next generations. But it will take some generations to see what how well they thrive. At the same time, you'll see a continued shedding of nominals from the Christian categories, but it's important to realise that there are branches of the Christian Church in Australia that are in reasonably healthy shape and have been growing for decades. So you'll see gradual shifts of different kinds for the future. My guess is, coming back to what Lyle was speaking about, the energy of the atheists, as it were, that wanted to discount the Christian presence, is that some of the energy will go out of those groups. I think you'll still get the political push to change privileges for religions in taxes and other ways, but I don't think we'll ever see again the same kind of energy that went into getting people to put atheists on the census. They've sort of made their point there, and they'll be moving on to other battles. So yeah, I think we'll see continued transformation. I wouldn't say that Australia's on a track to becoming completely secularized society by any means. Religion's got a lot in it. I mean, there was this view 10, 20 years ago that God is dead and religion's on its way out. That's not true all over the world. And as Australia continues to bring migrants in from Southeast Asia, from the Pacific, from South Asia, we're going to see growth of all the religions that are represented by those immigrants, including Christianity.
Yeah. Interesting. What are your thoughts, Lyle, on the future for Australia and Christianity and religion and all of these things?
I actually think it's quite bright, Caleb. I'm optimistic about the future. I think there's a real opportunity now that we're having this, I guess, sifting and the distilling and getting to, okay, who's really fair income about their faith. And with what modern secularism and materialistic culture has to offer, I think it's a very empty offering for many people, as you were just saying, Caleb. You don't have to scratch very deeply in many people's lives to find areas of dysfunction and disappointment and anxiety, and things which only a relationship with Jesus Christ and in community with his people can really fill. So I think as those Christians who are serious about the gospel, serious about their faith, serious about Christian community, serious about impacting their communities and going to the pain points that every community has beyond the veneer of our materialistic self-sufficiency, I think there's huge opportunities, and I think the light will only shine brighter. And we see through history this has always been the case. There's been cycles of decline, and then as society falls apart around the people of faith, people of the church, it becomes more and more attractive. And I think that will be the case. And I agree with Mark about the wonderful migrants that are coming from Asia and the Pacific, who really are re-evangelizing us and showing us the way through their zeal and their commitment and example of faith in Christ. So I think there's loads of upside. It's probably good that we're shedding the nominals. Let's get serious and let's get on with the mission of the gospel. So I think there's a bright future ahead.
I had a thought, an image.
Agree.
I had an image that occurred to me, is that like a candle shines brighter in the pitch black than of of the dark night than it does in the dusk.
Yeah,
And I
that's
think
right.
we've been coming through the dusk. And one of the things that really is important is something that Lyle said, that the Christian view of the human person is that we're made in the image of God. And that that idea, which has had such a huge influence on Western civilization, has been in decline in our culture. And the alternatives are becoming clearer. And they're pretty dark alternatives, actually. The purely materialistic view of the human person. We're seeing the influence of the alternatives, but they're becoming less credible too as time passes. So there's a huge opportunity for the church to speak with a clear voice about what it means to be human. I think this issue of who we are as human beings is the most divisive and difficult, profound question that Australian society faces today. And this shift in the census is pointing to a crisis of identity for us as a nation. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to have an identity at all? We're seeing the issues over women's sport that are just but one sort of sub issue that really go back to this deeper issue. And I just really hope and pray, and I believe the church will step up, and that its voice will be clearer, and people will be able to think with more clarity about what does it mean to accept that Christian message that there is an inherent human dignity because we're made in the image of God.
Yeah, agree. I think for me as a pastor, the census results aren't surprising, but yeah, I'm positive. I feel excited about the future. I'd rather know where people stand in their faith or lack of faith, and actually work from that position of clarity as a pastor. I think for me, thinking about my role in the community, thinking about my church or my friends who have churches or the church across Australia, I really agree with you, Mark. I think clarity is so important, and maybe that's where the church has not served the Australian community as well as it could have in that area of clarity and what we're actually standing for. And what we stand for should be very different to what the culture stands for. Really, the message of Jesus is quite radical, obviously, to the normal human way of living, to the human condition, and I think that's a challenge I'm finding myself. Like, how can I be more clear about what we actually stand for? Because Jesus meeting God, I mean, Jesus is irresistible. He's the best friend you could ever have. I think a lot of the problem with the church is that there's a bunch of other obstacles that are kind of we get in the road, I suppose, of facilitating that connection of your average Aussie to, hey, this is who God really is, and he wants to know you, and you would want to know him if you met him, and get all the churchy mechanics, religious stuff out the road that's not helping or not facilitating connecting people to God. So I'm very excited about that. But I think the church, and I'd love to hear your opinion, guys, but I think the church really needs to assess its methods. Obviously, our mission never changes, our message never changes, but the methods and the way that we approach is really, really important. I love the census data in that sense because I know, therefore, who I'm talking to out there in the community. I'm not having some, I suppose, perverted idea of what an Aussie is like. I'm like, okay, this is where it's at, and embrace the reality of that. And then, what methods can we use as a church to represent the gospel better? So, what are your thoughts on that, guys, on the church and what the church could be doing better?
I think it's important that the church rediscovers its moral voice. I think the church has made a big mistake in the last 100 or so years in retreating to pietism. Now, don't get me wrong, pietism is important. Our relationship with Jesus, as you've just so well said, Caleb, is so important to know Jesus as a friend. But the great project of the Enlightenment, to quote Tom Wright, was to put the God stuff upstairs in some sort of spiritual realm in the clouds, and to leave the downstairs affairs of running the world to those who are secular, those who are non-religious, and that hasn't worked out well. And the church has allowed itself to be co-opted into that, and therefore the world has missed the moral voice of the church, and it's allowed itself to be portrayed as just being, moralizing or judgmental. But I think courage and a willingness to be countercultural is something that the church really needs to take on, and that's part of turning this light on in the darkness. And so I think we've got to rediscover our moral voice, our ability to speak, and always, truth with grace. But we must speak because we've allowed ourselves to be silenced by the mantra that, oh, you're just being judgmental, you're only against things, and yeah, there might be some validity in critiques like that, but the effect has been silence, and silence is not an option. We've got to continue to speak into the public square, into the
Yeah,
moral vacuum, despite the fact that it might be unpopular at times.
yeah. How do we do that better, Lyle? Because I think the tone of the church has this tone of being judgmental. I think that is a criticism that comes from the average Aussie. How do we do that better? Speak the truth without this tone of condemnation.
Look, I think this tone of condemnation is probably a little bit of a caricature that has been allowed to develop. Most contemporary Christian leaders that I know do speak with great creativity and grace into the public square when they do, and I don't think we hear enough of it. So I think we've got to be willing to withstand those who will put up straw men to try and discredit us or to cower us into silence. So I think courage is probably the first ingredient. I would rather see church leaders err a little rather than not speak at all. But I think
Yeah,
there are, creative ways we can engage the culture. There's a lot of thoughtful people in the church. I think it's being able to speak into I think the obvious failings of our culture and to, in a pastoral way, point those out and then point to something better. And then, most importantly, we as Christian communities have got to be able to model the gospel. And and this is a much bigger issue, but one I think the church must grapple with, and that is the unity in the body of Christ. And
yeah,
perhaps our marginalisation, as evidenced in these latest census figures, might drive us towards the ecumenism of the trenches, the fact that we are a little bit under siege in a hostile culture with aggressive secularists who do have an animus towards us. So hopefully that might bring us together across denominational boundaries. And then, if we can show that love for one another and the ability to work together, that of course is one of the greatest witnesses to the
yeah.
gospel, as we read in the scriptures. By this shall all men know that you're my disciples if you have love for one another. So I think getting
Spot
our
on.
own house in order is another way. So courage to speak to the culture, finding each other, and an expression of unity in our local communities and in the nation, I think will go a long way towards addressing some of the malaise that we find ourselves in.
It's great. Fantastic. Yeah, I think I think a lot of the issue that I find as well as a pastor when I look across the church, I just feel like so much of the church is focused on itself and focused inwardly, focused on preaching to the choir, so to speak. I just wonder, I suppose, to your point, Lyle, getting better at speaking to the felt needs in the community is definitely something I'm challenged with. It's easy to speak to my mates at church when I preach a sermon, but actually thinking through, well, most people aren't in church now or listening to podcasts from pastors or Christians, and there might be 96, 97% of Australians who aren't really involved in a church or hearing a sermon or really interested in that ecumenical discussion or whatever. So how do we speak better to the felt needs of the culture and be more outward facing, I suppose, which is really hard because like for any community or any human, it's always easier to go with the people you like and the people that are familiar. But the great call of Christianity is actually it's the only organisation that really is more interested in its non-members, in those that aren't here. It should be, and that's really the mission of Jesus is not for the healthy, but for the sick and for those who don't know. And I hope, Lyle, like you're saying, that this is a time, that this is a kind of divine kick up the backside to go, hey, church in Australia, sort yourself out better, get your focus right. Maybe a few less conferences with ourselves and a bit more thinking through strategically how we can be better follow Jesus and better bring the gospel to our communities. So, what
I
about
had
yourself?
I had I had three thoughts about that question. I agreed with Lyle's comments as well. One is I think the church should no longer be defending traditional Western culture. We should be positioning ourselves as having a radical perspective. What do I mean by that? Just an example with the marriage debate. Um, Sometimes Christians were heard as speaking up for traditional marriage, but I think we should have been speaking up for Christian marriage. And that could be played out in a number of different areas. So there are many people in the community who regret the fading of Western culture and its traditions of liberty. And those things I feel grieved about as well. But as a Christian, I think we need to equip our people and ourselves to speak with a radical gospel voice. The second point is I think evangelism is often assumed a kind of Christian consciousness or Christian awareness. So you could appeal to people's sense of sin, for example, in presenting the gospel. Now, I don't think that is as strong as it used to be, and you can't assume that people even know what sin is or that it
Yeah,
exists as a category in people's thought. So we have to dig deeper and equip our people in presenting the gospel to actually engage with the worldviews that are in secular society and to challenge them at their roots, so they point out their failures, their inconsistencies. So we need to equip people for evangelism that kind of digs deep into the worldview issues. What does it mean to be human is a key issue. And I think every Christian who wants to be an evangelist needs to be able to speak cogently and powerfully about what it is to be a human being and how Jesus Christ answers that question for us. The third thing has to do with discipleship. I think we've had a crisis of discipleship in Western Christianity, and we've been disabled in a number of different ways. I think Pentecostals have picked up some of that challenge and addressed some of the challenge, but the Enlightenment has caused us in our discipleship to focus on basically the renewal of the mind of Christians, but not really equipping them in the whole of their life to follow Christ. And I think you need to actually dig quite deep in the way you disciple people to transform their worldviews, to equip them to live the life of the Spirit, to be people of prayer, to be have a sense of time that's a biblical view of time and not just a kind of contemporary cultural view of time, not to have a divided world where your religion is what you do on Sundays and what you do during the week is something else. So I think, those three things a more radical view to engaging with the culture, equipping our people in evangelism to dig deep and challenge the secular worldviews that people have been captured by, and thirdly, to have a much more comprehensive approach to discipleship and to
it's
get
great.
past this pietistic view that Lyle spoke about.
It's great. Really, really good. I really appreciate your feedback today, guys, and just your thoughts on the census and responding to it. Maybe if you'd like to say a final word as we finish up, but appreciate that you are out there as a voice, maybe sometimes crying out in the wilderness, but as a voice doing your bit for the work of the kingdom of God, and appreciate your flexibility even jumping in here today. So would you like to say something to finish off, Lyle?
Appreciate the opportunity to speak into this, particularly in such a esteemed company with Mark and yourself. But my only final reflection would be that this is a great opportunity for young people who might be looking to be countercultural uh, for the reasons we've discussed about the culture. And I just think that young people, they do have a great ability to detect what's authentic and what's not. I think we've seen the complete failure of the 1960s sexual revolution, its ability to provide sexual flourishing, relational flourishing, family flourishing, a whole range of things there that I think young people will be attracted towards the message of the church
Right.
because it's such a countercultural message. So,
Good point.
I'd like to finish on that note of optimism.
I love it. I love it. That's a great point. Mark, do you have any final reflections?
Well, Caleb, you're in apparently the most secular municipality in perhaps the most secular state in Australia. So you're on the cutting edge of the challenge, and I just encourage you to do as Lyle was saying, and get those young people to be radical in presenting the gospel. And I think you'll see a great hunger and a need. Maybe you're at the point in a place in a time where there will be great opportunities because the emptiness that surround you will be deeply dissatisfying to people. So, I'm really curious to see how your ministry goes in that place you're on the front line there.
That's great, as we all are, so in our different areas and fields. So, well, really appreciate your time today, guys, and enjoy the rest of it.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
I trust you were impacted by that Leadership Lessons podcast. I would love to hear your thoughts about today's podcast. Please comment down below and please review the podcast and share it with a friend. Doing this inspires us and helps others to find the podcast. See you next time.